The next book that I read in January was A Body in the Library. This is the third Miss Marple novel by Agatha Christie. So I am now 3 of 14 in the Marple collection in my Christie project, which I'll talk about later on this month. In The Body in the Library, a unknown woman is found murdered in the Bantry's library. And because she's a rather risky, beautiful, modern woman, tongues start wagging and everybody thinks that Mr Bantry liked her and that maybe she has a lot to do with him and not a lot to do with Mrs Bantry. This wasn't my favourite story in the Marple universe. It did feature some of my favourite characters. Colonel Milchet is in there, of course Miss Marple is in there, and the Bantrys, who I absolutely love. Dolly Bantry is just, she's nuts. But I think it suffered from coming off the back of the 13 Tales, which is the book before this, which is an interlinked collection of short stories, which was fabulous and I absolutely loved last month. So I gave this one 3.5 stars. Oh, and I guessed it. I guessed it this time, which I never do. I am the type of person who likes to go into a mystery novel and not make any guesses. I don't want to know. I don't want to know anything. I want to be completely surprised by all the red herrings and all the twists, and I'm quite happy to be naive right up until the final page, but I guessed this one and I think that spoiled it a little bit for me. The next book that I read was Dear Mr Youve, which is Mary Louise-Parker's debut novel. It's her first memoir. I don't know whether she's going to write any more. I really hope that she is. I hope that she's going to write lots more, because this was fabulous. This was the second novel which made me amazingly emotional this month. It is a look at Mary Louise-Parker through a series of letters that she writes to random men in her life. Some of them are related to her, some of them are very, very vaguely on the fringes of her existence and have touched her life at one point or another. Some of them she didn't even meet but saw in passing and they represented as something for her. And I love the format of this novel because it is written in letters and it is not a linear narrative or even a narrative which shows chunks of time. It really does jump about. You have to reorientate yourself with every letter. It was fabulous. It felt far more intimate than reading a straight up linear narrative. I absolutely loved it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I think it is definitely my favourite novel of the year so far. I know that we're only in February, but it's going to take a lot to knock this off of the top slot. I am going to do a separate review on this one very shortly because it's too good not to ramble about at length. The next book that I read this month was Me Before You by Jojo Moyes. And to this I say, oh lordy, I was emotionally devastated by this book. I love it. I absolutely love it, but it wounded me. So this novel is about Lou Clark, who has lost her job at a little cafe in the small, sleepy, historical town that she works in. They have a castle and a lot of tourist trade, and when her cafe shuts down, she's kind of lost because it's what she's always done and she really doesn't think she could be good at anything else. So she has to go to the job centre and go through the humiliating process of finding a job, and the only job that she's really qualified for with no qualifications is to be a carer, which by the way is an absolute travesty because it is a very real problem in the UK that carers are in general a fairly crappily paid job, and people kind of look down on you being a carer, which is something that's addressed in this book in a wonderful, wonderful way. Lou gets a job as a carer to a paraplegic man named Will, who has had his very, very active, very high-flying lifestyle rudely ripped away from him. And Lou is brought in not just to be a carer, but also to be a companion for him and to drag him a little bit out of his shell. I am going to say right now that if you want to watch the movie of this, but you want to read the book first. Do not watch the movie trailers because, as always, the movie trailer gives loads away, ridiculous amounts away. So if you're planning to read the book before watching the movie, avoid all media. relating to it, read this first. I have had this on my shelf for years, literal years. I bought this as soon as it came out in paperback. It was Lindsay from Lindsay Ray's fault that I actually picked it up now when I did and listened to the audiobook, which by the way is a astounding cast narration. It's wonderful. If you're gonna pick this up and you are considering reading an audiobook, I would pick it up in audiobook form. And Lindsay, I'll link Lindsay's video below where she talks about it, but one of the things that she says is that she spent time hyperventilating at the end of this novel and actually had to go and put it down and walk away because she was hyperventilating from crying. When I was listening to this novel, I was on the last 20 minutes of it when I was driving home. I pulled into my street, I parked in front of my house in the dark, I turned the lights off in my car and I listened to the last 15 minutes of this sobbing so hard in my car, hunkered down in the seat in case any of my neighbours saw me. It's so good. It's another 5 out of 5. It's on my treasured read shelf. I did really well this month, apparently. And the last thing that I read this month will maybe not come as any surprise after I've talked about other books in this haul. I can't say anything else because it will be a huge spoiler to tell you which book this relates to. This is Shaking Hands with Death by Terry Pratchett. This is his Richard Dimbleby lecture, which was delivered in, I think, was it 2010? Yeah, 2010, when he was first diagnosed with Alzheimer's and was making his documentary about the right to have assisted death in the UK. And it's tiny, but it got me. And again, I read this aloud. We read it in one sitting. It's affecting and moving and funny. I didn't expect it to be so funny. I don't know why, because it's Terry Pratchett, but I guess I haven't really read anything by Pratchett which was published after his Alzheimer's really started to affect him. And I suppose I imagined that it would have taken a little bit of him away, but it didn't. It didn't. He was still very, very present in this. It was hard to rate this because it's tiny, but I gave it a 4.5. I think the other half star, there were a couple of things that were just really gently touched on that I wanted in more detail, but of course it's a lecture to a captive audience in an auditorium and it couldn't have been as long as I wanted it to be. I want him to have written a book on this, but of course he didn't. So 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I think you should pick this up. And then prepare yourselves for my first DNF of the year.